All right, folks, let's talk about Descartes' Eidological argument. So in the previous presentation, we were introduced to the philosophy of René Descartes. And what we learned is that Descartes' primary concern was to discover something that can be known with absolute certainty. He concludes that the cogito ergo sum is that thing which can be known with absolute certainty. And from the cogito, Descartes believed that the next logical step was to prove God's existence, so to refute the evil demon doubt. And in the Meditations on First Philosophy, Descartes offers two proofs for God's existence, the Eidological argument and the ontological argument. And because the Eidological argument is more straightforward, we're just going to focus on this one. So unlike St. Thomas Aquinas, Descartes' proofs are Platonic or rationalist in nature. So rather than providing empirical proof of God's existence in the natural world, Descartes relies upon pure reasoning. That is, Descartes analyzes the very idea of God as a way to prove that God exists. So he begins his meditation with the assumption that the concept of God refers to a perfect infinite being. So he says, okay, what do I think of when I think of the term God? Well, I think of this perfect infinite being. So here's the question. Where did this idea of a perfect infinite being come from? That is, our ideas don't just come from nowhere. Like, for example, I have the idea of chocolate in my mind. So where did this idea of chocolate come from? I didn't just create it myself. It must have come from somewhere. So where did this idea of God, or this perfect infinite being, come from? Well, this is where we jump into the Eidological argument. So as you can see, I have organized it in premise-conclusion format, rather like the other proofs for God's existence. So let's just start with the first premise. So Descartes says, I have in my mind the idea of a perfect and infinite being. So somehow he has this idea in his head and it intuitively makes sense to him. But where did this idea come from? Well, this idea could not have originated in an imperfect infinite world. That is, it's not like Descartes learned this concept by observing the natural world, because the natural world is imperfect and it's finite. So there's no way that a perfect infinite thing could have been learned by observing the natural world. So he clearly didn't get it from, living his life. Thirdly, this idea cannot have originated in an imperfect finite mind. So in other words, there's no way Descartes himself could have come up with the idea, because his mind is finite and imperfect. So there's no way that a finite, imperfect mind could come up with the idea of a perfect infinite being. So what does he conclude? Well, he concludes that this idea could only have originated from a perfect infinite being, and that this perfect infinite being equals God, and therefore God exists. That is, put simply, Descartes argues that all ideas come from somewhere. Finite imperfect ideas originate from the finite imperfect world, or from the finite imperfect mind. So for example, chocolate comes from the imperfect world because chocolate is finite and imperfect. But infinite and perfect ideas can only come from a perfect infinite being, God. So in other words, Descartes is saying, where did this idea of God come from? Well, God put it in our minds, and that proves, therefore, that God exists. So if you are grasping his argument, what do you think? Are you convinced? Is this idea that somehow the idea of God was planted in our minds by God, and that's the only explanation for how the concept of God got in our minds? What do you think? I'm curious to know.